I'm Lara Kane, and if you ever find yourself tangled up in a web of family drama, corporate power struggles, and a whole lot of inherited wealth, take a lesson from me. Run. Because right now, I'm stuck in a nightmare that's about to get a whole lot worse. Unless I can pull off the wildest plan in the history of bad decisions. My stepfather, Marcus Thorne, is tightening his grip on my inheritance, and I'm out of options. If I don't do something fast, he'll take everything. My business, my freedom, my future. So I came up with a risky, crazy plan. Hire someone to pose as my husband, act as my legal guardian, and protect me from Marcus. And I'll pay him $2 billion for it. Enter Lance Carter. He's a mercenary, a wild card who doesn't play by the rules, and he's the last person I thought I'd ask for help. But when I pitched the idea, he barely blinked. His response? You're either brilliant or completely out of your mind. Either way, I'm in. And just like that, my wild plan had a wild card partner. What could possibly go wrong? Story begins. Visit our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this, hit like, share, and subscribe to join our channel's journey. The first time I walked into Lance Carter's office, I questioned every life decision that had brought me to this point. The room looked like a cross between a survivalist bunker and the set of a low-budget action movie. A wall-mounted rack displayed an alarming variety of knives, ranging from that could butter toast to that could gut a rhino. The desk, held together by duct tape and prayer, was littered with energy drink cans, crumpled maps, and what appeared to be a live grenade doubling as a paperweight. And then there was Lance, reclining in a chair that probably violated several OSHA standards. He was chomping on a burrito, with the confidence of a man who just dared death to blink first. His combat boots were propped on the desk, a plume of mud flakes crumbling onto a stack of paperwork labeled urgent. Can I help you? He asked, mid-chew, as though strangers barging in with contracts were an everyday occurrence. Yes, I said, planting myself in front of his desk like a lawyer about to argue for bail. Marry me. He froze, the burrito suspended halfway to his mouth. Slowly, he lowered it, staring at me as if I'd just offered him a pet velociraptor. Are you insane, ma'am? Clinically. No, practically. Definitely. I slapped the contract onto his desk, narrowly missing a puddle of what might have been motor oil. I'm not here to fall in love, Mr. Carter. I'm here to rent a husband. You can rent those? He asked, deadpan. You can now. Lance leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. His biceps strained against his shirt, which was fraying at the edges like it had been through a bar fight or 10. Let me get this straight. You want me to marry you. For 1 year, and in exchange, $2 billion. He whistled low, finally putting the burrito down. Lady, that's a lot of tacos. What's the catch? No catch. Just a few conditions. I slid a laminated page across the desk. At the top, in bold lettering, it read the agreement. Lance picked it up and squinted at the bullet points, mumbling them out loud. 1 year of cohabitation as a married couple. 0 emotional entanglements. He glanced up. Sounds cold, but okay. Protect Lara at all costs. He raised a brow. Getting a little dramatic here, but continue. No snooping into her mysterious art obsession. At this last point, Lance leaned back, tossing the page onto the desk. Art obsession, huh? What's that about? Finger painting on the weekends. That's need to know. And you don't need to know, I said with a saccharine smile. Stick to the contract. Right. 1 year, $2 billion. A marriage in name only. Got it, he said, though his grin suggested he was already regretting this. And what happens if either of us breaks one of these rules? Do I lose an arm or something? You lose $1 billion, I said sweetly. Lance's grin vanished. That's steep. What happens if you break the rules? I gave him my best poker face. I don't break rules. His gaze lingered on me for a long, unsettling moment before he picked up the pen. Well, Miss Kane, you just hired yourself a husband. God help us both. And with that, he signed his name. As I left the office, feeling the weight of the signed contract in my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a deal with a man who thrived on chaos. The next year was going to be wild. The moment Lance Carter set foot in my apartment, I realized I'd invited chaos into my life in combat boots. He arrived unannounced at 7 a.m., carrying a military-grade duffel bag that looked suspiciously like it had smuggled contraband across several borders. The bag hit the floor with a metallic thunk that made Diego, my emotional support llama, shoot me a look that screamed. What have you done? This is it? Lance asked, surveying my minimalist, plant-filled sanctuary with a look of open disdain. Where's the TV? The recliner. The man cave. This is my apartment, not a bachelor pad. I snapped, crossing my arms. Lance shrugged, unzipped his bag, and started pulling out an arsenal that could have supplied a small army. Knives, tactical gear, something that looked suspiciously like a flamethrower, and a grenade. He placed them on the floor in a neat, horrifying row. "You're not keeping those here," I shrieked. "I go where they go," he said, unbothered, as he carefully placed the grenade on the coffee table. "Not on my coffee table. Relax, it's not live." He grinned, which did absolutely nothing to reassure me. After transforming my living room into what could only be described as a low-budget action movie set, Lance decided it was time to conquer my kitchen. I followed him cautiously, half expecting him to declare war on my blender or turn my toaster into a tactical weapon. He flung open the fridge door with all the subtlety of a SWAT raid and immediately grimaced like he just uncovered a crime scene. "No meat?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "I'm vegetarian," I said, holding my head high, though it felt like I was announcing my allegiance to an alien species. "Figures," he muttered, his tone implying that this explained every questionable life choice I'd ever made. He reached into the fridge and plucked out a container of tofu with 2 fingers, holding it as though it were a live grenade. "What is this?" "Cement. It's tofu," I said, already regretting allowing this man into my life. "That's not food." He dropped it back into the fridge with a thud loud enough to rattle my jars of organic gem, then reached for a beer. At 7:30 in the morning. "Do you even know what a balanced diet looks like?" I asked, my arms crossed as I glared at the beer can in his hand. "Sure, it's a burger in one hand and a beer in the other," he replied without missing a beat, popping the tab on the beer and taking a long, unapologetic sip. "And breakfast?" I pressed, unable to let it go. "Cold pizza," he said, looking at me like it was the most obvious answer in the world. "Or leftover Chinese? But you're fresh out of both, so." He gestured vaguely toward the tofu, clearly not considering it an option. "I have oatmeal," I offered, trying to salvage some semblance of nutritional decency. "Oatmeal?" He scrunched up his face like I just suggested eating drywall. "What am I, horse?" "Well, you do kind of stomp around like one," I muttered under my breath. He chuckled, unfazed. "Listen, Princess Kale, you stick to your rabbit food, and I'll stick to what keeps me alive." "Deal." "Fine," I said, waving him off. "But don't come crying to me when your arteries stage a revolt." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it," he said with a smirk, heading back to his newly fortified living room with his breakfast beer in hand. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to finish turning your couch into a defensive stronghold." As I watched him walk away, beer can glinting in the morning sunlight, I wondered for the 100th time if I'd made the worst decision of my life, or the most entertaining one. And then, Lance met Diego. It was like watching an unstoppable force collide with an immovable object, except the force was a battle-hardened mercenary, and the object was a llama wearing a knitted bow tie. Lance froze in the doorway to the living room, his expression a strange cocktail of disbelief and mild horror, like he just stumbled upon a live grenade someone forgot to mention. "Why," he began slowly, gesturing at Diego with a gloved hand, "is there a llama in your apartment?" "He's not just a llama," I said, stepping protectively in front of Diego like a mother shielding her child. "He's my friend." Lance squinted, his eyes flicking between me and Diego as if trying to decide which of us needed professional help more. Diego, sensing the hostility radiating from Lance like a bad Wi-Fi signal, let out a low, huffy snort and narrowed his dark, judgmental eyes. "What's it doing?" Lance asked, a note of caution creeping into his voice. Before I could answer, Diego delivered his signature move, a precision spit attack aimed directly at Lance's face. Lance dodged with the reflexes of a man who'd survived multiple firefights, the glob landing harmlessly on the floor behind him. "That thing just tried to kill me," he exclaimed, pointing accusingly at Diego like he was reporting a war crime. "He's just asserting dominance," I said smugly, reaching up to scratch Diego's head. "It means he doesn't trust you yet." "Yet," Lance repeated, wiping his sleeve with the kind of grim resignation that suggested he'd already given up on arguing with me. I smiled sweetly. "Give it time. You two might even become friends." "Friends," he echoed, glancing warily at Diego, who was now chewing on one of my decorative throw pillows. "That thing looks like it's plotting my demise." Diego, as if to prove Lance's point, stomped his hoof and let out a long, guttural groan that sounded vaguely like a threat. "This," Lance said, pinching the bridge of his nose, "is going to be a long year." He stepped around Diego with exaggerated caution, giving the llama a wide berth as he made his way to the fortified couch that now doubled as his command center. "I'll stay out of its way," he called over his shoulder. "But if it spits on me again, I'm charging it rent." Diego, clearly unimpressed, let out another snort and flopped onto the rug in the center of the room, claiming his territory with the air of a monarch who knew his throne was untouchable. As I watched Lance glare at Diego from the safety of his couch, I couldn't help but think that, for better or worse, this was going to be the most entertaining year of my life. By mid-afternoon, I was already Googling how to annul a mercenary marriage and debating if faking my own death might be easier. It all started innocently enough when Lance announced he was hungry and decided to make toast a seemingly harmless task for most people, but, in his hands, a disaster waiting to happen. My sleek, state-of-the-art toaster was clearly unprepared to meet a man who treated every appliance like it might explode. "This thing have a manual," he grumbled, jabbing at random buttons like a bomb squad member under pressure. "It's a toaster," I said, already bracing for impact. "It toasts. Just push the lever." With a skeptical glance, Lance shoved the lever down. When the toast popped up moments later with a cheerful ding, he flinched, reflexively reaching for his knife. "Your toaster's hostile," he muttered, glaring at it like it had insulted his mother. Before I could respond, he turned his back, completely ignoring the bread still sitting in the toaster. Moments later, smoke began curling out of the machine, the bread transforming into what could only be described as weaponized charcoal. "Lance!" I shouted, waving a dish towel in front of the smoke detector. He turned around, taking in the smoke with a casual shrug. "It's just a little crispy. That toast could be used as a riot shield." He didn't even blink. "I like it well done." Then came the stakeout incident. After an hour of pacing the apartment like a caged animal, Lance declared that someone was following me. "No one is following me," I said, rolling my eyes. "Then what do you call that?" he said, pointing dramatically out the window. I followed his gaze to see my yoga instructor, Carl, stretching in front of the building with his ever-present water bottle and rolled-up mat. "That's my yoga teacher," I said slowly. "Or he's a spy," Lance countered, narrowing his eyes. Before I could stop him, he bolted out the door. What followed was a scene straight out of an action movie if the movie were directed by a slapstick comedian. Lance tackled poor Carl into a hedge, sending his yoga mat flying. "That's my yoga teacher," I screeched, sprinting to the scene. He was loitering. Lance protested as I dragged him off Carl, who was still clutching his water bottle like it was a flotation device. "His weapon is a water bottle, and his mission is mindfulness, not espionage." Carl, to his credit, didn't press charges, but he did give me a look that said I owed him at least a year of free classes. Finally, the pièce de résistance came, when Lance intercepted a very important delivery. My long-awaited bulletproof briefcase filled with highly illegal black market art supplies. I came into the living room to find him standing over the case, poking at it like it might contain C4. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, holding it up like it weighed 100 pounds. "Paint delivered like it's state secrets. Who are you, Banksy?" "Mind your business," I snapped, snatching it away before he could pry it open. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Normal people buy their art supplies from craft stores. This feels like a drug deal." "It's art, Lance. You wouldn't understand. Art that needs a bulletproof case. Are you painting or smuggling diamonds?" By the time he retreated to his couch fort for the night, muttering something about high-maintenance civilians, I was Googling with renewed detonation how to divorce someone who may accidentally burn your house down. It had only been one day, and I wasn't sure I'd survive the year. But then again, it wasn't boring. By the end of week 1, I'd learned several things about Lance, none of them comforting, all of them increasingly ridiculous. First, Lance was allergic to Diego, my emotional support llama. But rather than admit defeat, he declared it a battle of wills. "I'm not letting a glorified goat with a neck problem win," he growled, sneezing as he wiped Diego's spit off his sleeve for the 3rd time that day. Diego, for his part, rose to the challenge with the cold, unflinching detonation of a predator. Every morning, their standoff began anew. Lance would step into the living room, and Diego would stare him down from his perch on the couch. Yes, my couch. Diego had claimed it within 48 hours, and there was no going back. It was like watching two alphas in the wild, except one of them was a mercenary, with a knife strapped to his thigh, and the other was a 400-pound herbivore with impeccable spit aim. Second, Lance sleepwalked, with a knife. The first time it happened, I woke up to the sound of muffled footsteps, and the faint gleam of steel in the moonlight. My heart nearly stopped when I saw his silhouette in the hallway, knife in hand, mumbling something unintelligible about hostiles. "Lance," I whispered, my voice shaking. He turned, his eyes half open but unfocused, and muttered, "Secure the perimeter." Then he shuffled into the kitchen and stabbed the toaster. I didn't think it could get worse until the spy showed up. Apparently, Marcus Thorne, my charmingly evil stepfather, had sent a man to break into the apartment and gather intel. What he hadn't counted on was Lance's midnight wanderings. The poor spy barely made it through the window before Lance appeared. knife glinting in the dark, his sleep mumbling reaching a new level of creepy. Who goes there? Lance slurred, his voice low and gravelly. The spy, convinced he'd stumbled into a horror movie, screamed like a banshee, and leaped back out the window, landing in the dumpster below. I found Lance the next morning, sipping coffee, and completely unaware that he'd scared off a trained operative in his sleep. Third, Lance was utterly convinced I was hiding something. To be fair, he wasn't wrong. "You're up to something," he announced one afternoon, arms crossed as he leaned against the kitchen counter. "What makes you say that?" I asked, feigning innocence as I shoved a suspiciously large envelope of cash deeper into the junk drawer. He pointed at the stack of industrial paint cans in the corner, the bulletproof briefcase on the table, and the blueprint of the city skyline pinned to the fridge. "This doesn't exactly scream normal civilian. It's called being an artist," I said with a shrug. "You wouldn't understand." He narrowed his eyes. "Artists don't usually have burner phones. It's for creative emergencies, and those emergency walkie-talkies. Sound carries better," I said, trying not to sound like I was making it up as I went along. Lance didn't look convinced, but before he could press further, Diego walked by and smacked him with his tail, effectively ending the interrogation. By the end of week 1, I wasn't sure if Lance was more of a blessing or a curse. He was unpredictable, aggravating, and completely impossible to live with. But he was also the kind of guy who, despite his many flaws, made you feel like you could take on the world even if that world included a llama with a grudge and a stepfather hellbent on ruining your life. And honestly, that wasn't nothing. Despite our rocky start, and Lance's ongoing feud with Diego, which involved daily territorial disputes, and at least one dramatic stare-down per hour, something surprisingly unexpected began to happen. It all started with my paintings or, more accurately, my secret sketches. I hadn't told Lance about my art. Hell, I'd barely told myself about it lately, what with all the chaos my life had become. But whenever I had a moment to breathe, I found myself sketching him. Yes, him. There was just something about Lance, his rough-edged charm, his crooked grin, his absurd confidence and his complete lack of culinary ability, his defiance in the face of tofu that captivated me in ways I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way he moved through the apartment, like he owned it, or how his brow furrowed in concentration when he was doing anything that required more than zero effort. He was like a walking contradiction. Brash but thoughtful, aggressive but surprisingly considerate, especially when it came to my increasingly bizarre life. So, naturally, I started sketching him. His smirk as he grilled me on whether I'd seen the latest conspiracy video on YouTube. His scowl when I asked him to water the plants, which he'd somehow forgotten to do 5 days in a row. And the what? He looked at me sideways when I tried to explain my love of meditation. One day, while I was in the kitchen, my pencil idly moving across the paper, Lance strolled by, muttered something about the lack of meat in the fridge, and snatched a beer from the counter. It was only after he'd cracked it open that he stopped, glanced down at the page I was working on, and blinked. "What's this?" he asked, his voice strangely quiet. I turned the page to hide it, a little embarrassed. "Nothing." "Bullshit," he said, reaching over and flipping the page back. And there it was, a sketch of him, caught mid-grin, looking like a mix between a man and a walking disaster. "You're good," Lance said, nodding slowly. "Scary good." For a second, I was sure he was going to start making fun of me. But instead, he leaned against the counter, looking at the drawing with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You really see people, huh?" he said, almost to himself. "Like, see them." I blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer, just took another swig of his beer and walked off. But for some reason, that little exchange stuck with me all day. It was the first time he'd ever really seen me not as the heiress, or the artist on the run, but as a person. And then there was the storm. That night, the sky had decided to throw everything it had at us, and the winds were so fierce that I was pretty sure a tree was going to land on my balcony at any moment. Of course, Diego's shelter, the one that had taken 2 hours to build, mostly with my supervision, since Lance had declared construction an art in itself and tried to use duct tape as a building material, decided to collapse under the weight of the storm. I woke up to a strange sound, the sound of hammering. I groggily stumbled out of bed and into the living room, only to find Lance, covered in mud from head to toe, grunting as he hammered boards back into place on Diego's shelter. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. Lance didn't look up. "What does it look like I'm doing?" "Fixing Diego's house," he grumbled. "Your damn llama's got more needs than a toddler." "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I wasn't used to anyone fixing things for me, especially not Lance, who had spent most of the week glaring at Diego every time the llama farted in his direction. Lance paused, wiping mud from his cheek with the back of his hand. Diego's annoying as hell, but he's family now. And I don't let family live in a hole in the ground. I blinked. I wasn't sure why, but hearing that made something in my chest tighten. Despite his chaotic, unpredictable nature, despite the countless times he had ruined my morning coffee, or made me question whether or not he was a walking disaster, Lance had just without thinking done something nice. I stood there for a moment, watching him work. His sleeves rolled up, his jaw set in detonation, and it hit me, right then and there, that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement wasn't going to be a complete disaster. Sure, Lance was unpredictable, messy, and occasionally terrifying. Yes, he had a habit of sleepwalking with knives and tackling innocent yoga instructors. And yes, he was still convinced I was hiding some deep, dark secret about my involvement in underground art heists. But beneath all that chaos, he was also fiercely loyal in his own strange, sometimes terrifying way. And suddenly, the idea of spending a year with him didn't seem like the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Sure, he still hadn't figured out that my idea of a peaceful morning involved silence and chamomile tea, not a ninja-esque mercenary throwing himself at my yoga teacher in the middle of a downward dog. But maybe that was okay. Maybe we didn't have to be perfect just together. It wasn't exactly what I had signed up for, but it was starting to feel like I always thought I was good at keeping secrets. Turns out, I wasn't as slick as I'd hoped, especially not with Lance Carter in my corner, or rather, breathing down my neck with his unrelenting suspicion and knack for finding trouble. It started innocently enough, or as innocently as anything involving Lance ever could. "Where were you last night?" he asked one morning, his tone casual, though his eyes gleamed with interrogation mode intensity. "Out," I replied, trying to keep my cool as I sipped my coffee. "Out where? None of your business." Lance leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, and his smirk maddeningly confident. "You're not as sneaky as you think, you know. The black paint under your nails is a dead giveaway. That, and you left your gas mask in the bathroom. Again, damn it. What do you want, Lance?" I snapped, already bracing for the lecture. "I want to know why you're risking your neck sneaking around the city at night like a wannabe vigilante," he said, grabbing a banana from the fruit bowl and peeling it with dramatic flair. I stayed silent. "You know," he continued, taking a bite and gesturing with the banana, "most people don't hire mercenaries to play house just to go off and do something stupid like this. So what gives?" I set my mug down and stared him straight in the eye. "Fine. You want the truth. I'd love it. I'm Kane." He blinked. "Great. Cool. What's that supposed to mean?" I groaned, running a hand through my hair. "Kane, the street artist. The one with the murals. The one your beloved tabloids can't shut up about." Realization dawned on his face, followed by disbelief. Then something akin to begrudging admiration. "The one with the giant mural of the mayor eating money. That's you." "Yes." Lance let out a low whistle and tossed the banana peel into the trash. "Well, hell, no wonder your stepdad hates you. That last one with the puppeteer strings. Chef's kiss. Thanks, I guess. But seriously, do you have a death wish?" he asked, his tone abruptly serious. "You're not just poking the bear, you're punching it in the face and spray painting it for good measure." I shrugged. "Thorne deserves it. Someone has to expose him. And what happens when he finds out it's you?" I hesitated, staring at the floor. "That's why I hired you, remember?" For a moment, Lance said nothing. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're lucky I'm crazy enough to stick around for this." Lance, now fully aware of my double life as both a highly motivated street artist and someone who really liked keeping their business very separate from their mercenary husband, decided it was time to supervise my nocturnal activities. "You know, because nothing says trustworthy partner like surveillance and a surprising amount of high-tech gear. This is a stakeout," he declared one evening, dramatically dropping a duffel bag onto the floor of my art studio, like he was in a James Bond movie. The bag made an ominous thud, and I wasn't sure if it was filled with gadgets or just a few weeks' worth of his discarded socks. "We're not staking out anything," I said, crossing my arms and glaring at him, because this was supposed to be my art time, not a cheesy action movie. "You're right," he said, adjusting the straps of his tactical vest as if he had a mission. "I'm staking out, and you're my liability." Before I could protest, he started unpacking an alarming assortment of surveillance gear, snacks, and most disturbingly what appeared to be a night vision monocle. Yes, monocle. It had a strap, which somehow made it worse. "Is all this necessary?" I asked, watching in a mix of horror and disbelief as he set up a motion detector by the window, pointed it directly at the neighbor's cat, and seemed to think it was a brilliant idea. "Do you want to get caught by your stepdad's goons?" he asked, popping a handful of trail mix into his mouth like this was any other Thursday night. No? Then yes, it's necessary. Are you eating raisins with M&Ms again? I asked, horrified by the cross-contamination of sweet and salty that he was treating like a 5-star snack. Look, they're not going to eat themselves, he said, waving the bag dismissively. But seriously, are you planning to get caught? Because that's a no-go in my line of work, sweetheart. I sighed, because apparently no one understood the difference between doing art and doing illegal art, including Lance, who was somehow eating trail mix like it was the world's most casual stakeout snack. As the night dragged on, Lance alternated between scanning the streets with a pair of binoculars, which he insisted was a superior form of intelligence gathering, and interrogating me about my work. He'd already been through the wino meat in the fridge, and what kind of a person has a llama as a pet phases, so now it was time for a deeper dive into my actual secret life. So, what's the big plan? He asked, not taking his eyes off the window. His voice was practically vibrating with intensity. Don't make me ask twice. I hesitated. Could I trust him with the full truth? He'd proven himself loyal so far. But this was the kind of secret that could get us both killed. You don't have to tell me, he said after a beat, surprising me. But if you're planning to take down Thorn with a can of spray paint, I should probably know what I'm signing up for. I stared at him. So you're saying you'll help me if it's for a cause. But if it's just for some punk artist thing, then count you out. Well, yeah, I have standards, he said, smirking as he adjusted his monocle, which, for the record, was still strapped to his face. I'd need to know if we're dealing with more than just the city's worst paint job. I sighed. Fine, I'm working on my biggest project yet, a public mural that exposes my stepfather's entire operation. Names, dates, proof of corruption, all out in the open where he can't hide it. Lance's expression shifted from curiosity to impressed disbelief. He let out a low whistle. Bold. Stupid, but bold. Thanks, I think, I said, raising an eyebrow. That's why I need your help, I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. Not just to keep me safe, but to make sure it actually happens. I can't exactly. Wait, he interrupted. You're serious? I turned to face him, putting the paintbrush down with deliberate slowness. Deadly serious? His face softened for a second, and I saw something I hadn't expected, a flicker of something like concern, or maybe even respect. He turned back to the window, adjusted his monocle one last time, because obviously, and cracked a grin. Well, he said, turning to me with a new kind of detonation, if we're going to piss off a billionaire, we might as well make it fun. I stared at him, wondering what in the world had just happened. Lance, the guy who'd once looked at a tofu container like it was the worst betrayal in history, was now fully on board with the most absurd thing I'd ever attempted, and with him by my side, maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone in this fight as I'd thought. Sure, things were still a bit chaotic, and I was pretty sure at least one of his night vision monocles was an illegal import. But when you're up against $1 billion empire, who needs normal anyway? The next few weeks were a blur of midnight escapades, paint-smudged clothes, and increasingly absurd situations that made me wonder if I'd accidentally signed up for a spy movie instead of a covert art mission. Take, for example, the time Lance tackled a jogger because he thought they were a spy. I had barely been able to finish tying my shoes when I heard Lance shout, "Stop right there." And then, a heavy thud followed by an indignant "Hey." The jogger had barely made it 10 feet from us before Lance, in what could only be described as a military-grade maneuver, tackled him into a shrub. "Lance, what are you doing?" I shrieked, rushing over. "I knew it," Lance hissed, trying to pin the jogger to the ground like he was defusing a bomb. "Spies always run in the morning. Why else would they be jogging at this hour?" I looked at the jogger, who was now wriggling under Lance with a bewildered look on his face. "He's wearing running shoes, Lance. Running shoes. It's literally what people wear to, run. Not spy." The jogger managed to squirm free, brushing dirt off his shirt with a grimace. "I just wanted to get my cardio in. I'm not spying on anyone." Lance stared at him for a long moment, then gave a dramatic sigh. "Fine, but you should really watch where you're jogging next time." And that was the first of many missions where Lance's overzealous protective instincts got the best of him. Then, there was Diego's involvement in one of Lance's most chaotic nights yet. It all started when Lance's fancy motion detectors, installed by Lance himself, of course went off at 3 a.m., triggering a full-blown intruder response. Lance, dressed like he was preparing for a SWAT operation, tiptoed into the living room with a flashlight and a knife in hand. "What's going on?" I groaned, stumbling out of bed, my hair looking like it had been styled by a blender. "Diego triggered the sensor," Lance said, eyes narrowed as he peered into the dark. "I'm going to have to interrogate the suspect. Diego, who had just woken up and was now calmly chewing on a piece of hay in the corner, looked up with a huffy snort. Lance squinted at the llama, who stared back in deadpan confusion. So, we're not doing this the easy way, huh? Before I could explain that Diego wasn't actually a covert operative for my stepfather's corporate empire, Lance was crouched in front of him, holding a flashlight like he was about to solve a crime. What's the deal, Diego? Lance demanded. Who's pulling your strings? Who sent you? Diego stared at him for a moment longer before letting out a loud snort and walking away as though Lance was beneath him. This is ridiculous, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. He's just a llama, Lance. Lance stood up, brushing the hay off his tactical vest. Yeah, well, that llama is a serious threat. I decided, at that moment, that I might be losing my grip on reality. And then there was the art run, the one that really made me question my life choices. Lance insisted on coming with me to pick up supplies from one of my contacts, Bruno, a towering ex-con who looked like he could bench press a small car and probably had a few skeletons in his closet figuratively and literally. Bruno was one of my more interesting contacts, and by interesting, I meant absolutely terrifying. As we approached Bruno's warehouse, Lance gave me the side eye and muttered, "This guy doesn't look trustworthy." I rolled my eyes. He's fine, Lance. Trust me. He's just big. No, I'm serious, Lance said, narrowing his eyes as if Bruno was about to pull a gun from under his hoodie. I don't trust anyone who could strangle a bear with one hand. He's not that big, I said, trying to reassure him. You're freaking out over nothing. Well, I was wrong, because as soon as Bruno laid eyes on Lance, things got interesting. You didn't say you were bringing muscle, Bruno growled, eyeing Lance with suspicion. His hand, which had previously been resting casually on his massive bicep, suddenly hovered over a nearby pipe, just in case things went south. I'm not muscle, Lance shot back, crossing his arms. I'm security. Same thing, Bruno muttered, clearly unimpressed. Prove you're not a cop. Lance, never one to back down from a challenge, pulled a knife out of his boot like it was his ID. We're buying paint, not robbing a bank, I hissed, rushing between them before this could escalate into a full-blown gang war. Relax, sweetheart, Lance said, flashing me a grin. I've got this. And then, in what can only be described as a series of bad decisions, Bruno and Lance spent the next 10 minutes doing an impromptu test of Lance's criminal background. Bruno wanted a photo ID. Lance offered a toothpick. It was chaotic, ridiculous, and entirely unnecessary. Somehow, we made it out alive with the paint and no major injuries. But I swore that would be the last time Lance came on an art run. My life was already complicated enough without him accidentally sparking a turf war between artists and ex-cons. Still, I had to admit despite everything he was starting to grow on me. But for now, I was ready to get my mural done without a single incident. But I wasn't holding my breath. Despite the chaos, there was something oddly comforting about having Lance by my side. I mean, sure, he had a bizarre obsession with turning every situation into a potential combat zone. But it wasn't all bad. For all his gruffness, Lance never judged me for my choices. He didn't tell me to quit this nonsense or play it safe, like most people in my life had. No, instead, he silently accepted my art mission, even when it made absolutely zero sense. When I had to scale a building at 3 a.m. to put up a mural of my stepdad as a giant puppet master, Lance didn't question it. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He just made sure I didn't fall off the side of the building and get squashed by a passing pigeon. But it wasn't just the protecting me from certain death thing that made him stand out. Lance supported me in his own very unorthodox way. For instance, when my spray paint cans went missing, I was sure someone had stolen them. Probably Thorne's goons, I muttered, pacing around the apartment. Lance, after scanning the room with his usual paranoia, casually walked over, opened the fridge, and retrieved the cans from the vegetable crisper. You really need to stop hiding stuff in the weirdest places. They were in the fridge because I didn't want them to overheat, I said defensively. You think it's easy storing toxic fumes in 100-degree heat. Come on, I'm an artist, not an idiot. Lance just gave me an eye roll so dramatic it could have earned him an Oscar. Right, you're an artiste now. I stuck my tongue out at him. You just don't understand the struggle. You're right, he said dryly. But I'm happy to supply the gear. Just don't ask me to judge your artistic process. Another time, he got me out of a potentially disastrous location scouting situation. I'd picked a rooftop to add a new piece, thinking it was abandoned. Of course it wasn't. It was the home of a very grumpy, very drunk rooftop dweller who didn't take kindly to graffiti artists. Before the guy could even threaten to toss a bottle at me, Lance appeared, stepping out of the shadows like a well-dressed action movie hero. Nice place you've got here, he said with a sly grin, his hands on his hips. The guy looked at him like he'd just seen an angel, except with less halo and more tactical vest. Lance turned to me. I think we're done here. Time to go. Bye. Now, he said, cutting me off. And just like that, we were out of there, with me trailing behind him like a confused puppy. The man had a way of clearing out awkward situations that I could never quite replicate. It was like he was immune to people's attempts to intimidate him, especially when they were drunk and not armed with anything more dangerous than a half-empty beer bottle. But Lance wasn't just good at handling the bad guys, although that definitely helped. He also had the strange, unintentional way of keeping me grounded. Like the time we were sitting on the fire escape, trying to get some air after a long day of running from my stepfather's spies, and I started spiraling into one of my infamous anxiety rants. What if I fail? I muttered, staring down at the street below. What if Thorne finds out what I'm doing? What if? Lance interrupted me by tossing a peanut at my head. Hey, I protested, swatting at the peanut. What the hell? Shut up and listen for a second, he said, his tone surprisingly gentle, though his face was still as stone-faced as ever. You're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. So stop trying to sabotage yourself. You've got this. But if you keep running through every possible disaster scenario in your head, you're gonna talk yourself out of it before it even happens. I blinked at him, thrown off by the serious tone. You're actually being nice. I'm always nice, he said, his lips curling into a half smirk. You just don't notice, because I'm usually busy saving your ass. I let out a laugh, rolling my eyes. Sure, that's what it is. But there was something in the way he said it that made me stop. Made me think, maybe he's right. I'd gotten so caught up in my mission, in the need to be perfect, that I'd forgotten the most important part. I wasn't alone. And, for once, I let myself believe it. Slowly but surely, I realized that Lance wasn't just my mercenary husband, my overly paranoid bodyguard, or the guy who had an intense personal vendetta against Tofu. No, he was my partner, my ally, my friend, maybe even more than that. I wasn't sure exactly when it happened, but at some point between dodging his surveillance attempts and waking up to him fixing my art supplies, after definitely breaking them, I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Someone who had my back, no matter how ridiculous the situation was. I wasn't sure what the future held, or whether I'd survive this year-long contract with my sanity intact. But I was pretty sure that if I had Lance by my side, I could handle whatever came next. Even if that next thing was Diego deciding to go rogue and start his own art gallery. Well, I said, after a long, thoughtful silence, I guess we're doing this, huh? Lance's response was a simple, yep, and I'll make sure you don't burn the place down while you're at it. I smiled, shaking my head. You're a mess. Yeah, he said with a shrug, but I'm your mess. The closer we got to the end of our ridiculous contract, the harder it became to ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest. Lance Carter wasn't just my hired mercenary anymore. Somewhere between his outrageous antics and my desperate attempts to maintain control of my life, he had become someone who mattered, and that scared the hell out of me. It didn't help that Lance had started noticing everything, like how I'd bite my lip when I was stressed, or how I'd pause too long before answering questions about my childhood. Hey, he said one night, leaning against the doorframe of my studio, his arms crossed. You've been quiet lately. That's not like you. I glanced up from my sketch pad, trying to play it cool. I've been busy. Busy avoiding me, he asked, raising an eyebrow. No, I lied, immediately sounding unconvincing. He smirked, stepping closer. You're a terrible liar, you know that. I sighed, putting down my pencil. Why do you care? Because I'm your husband, remember? He said, grinning like a smug idiot. And because I'm pretty sure you're spiraling. And if you spiral, I spiral. And I don't like spiraling. Wow, thanks for the concern, I muttered, rolling my eyes. But as much as I wanted to brush him off, his words stuck with me. Later that week, we found ourselves sitting on the fire escape again, the city sprawling out below like a giant glittering postcard, with the faint hum of traffic providing an oddly soothing soundtrack to the chaos of our lives. A bottle of wine sat between us, because apparently even mercenaries needed a little help winding down after a long day of almost getting us killed. Repeatedly, Lance was staring at the skyline, his legs dangling over the edge as he took a swig from his bottle like it was water, while I tried to pretend I wasn't getting drunk from the sheer fumes of his presence. The guy could suck the elegance out of anything, even wine. I think it was a superpower. Maybe we should have gotten glasses, I said, eyeing the bottle suspiciously. Do you want to fight about glassware? Or are we going to talk about your feelings? Lance replied, deadpan. That was when he dropped the bombshell. You don't have to do this alone, you know, he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence like a wrecking ball through a brick wall. Do what? I asked, still half waiting for him to tell me we were being stopped by ninjas or something. Fight? Run? Whatever it is you're doing, he said, gesturing vaguely with his glass, as though the act of talking about my entire life's mission was as casual as picking out a new pair of socks. I stared at him, my brain trying to process the fact that Lance was using feelings in the same sentence as fight and run. This was the guy who had once described a traumatic encounter with a toaster as an ambush, and now he was talking about my emotions, like they were some kind of tactical operation. What are you saying? I asked, trying to sound casual. But I was pretty sure I sounded like a confused cat that had just been given a math test. I'm saying you don't have to keep pushing everyone away, he said, his voice suddenly softer than I'd ever heard it. You've got me, Lara? For now, at least. That for now, at least part, was the thing that stung. But I ignored it. I was a professional at ignoring stuff that hurt. It's how I'd survive being the art world's most notorious street artist and marrying a mercenary. Plus, there was no way I was going to let Lance see me lose my composure over that. My chest tightened, and I looked away, my gaze falling on the city below as if it might provide some kind of answer. It didn't. It just glowed back at me, indifferent. And what happens when the year is up? I asked, my voice a little less steady than I would have liked. When we go back to being strangers. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another swig from the bottle. Half of it was gone now, and I was definitely starting to feel a little buzzed. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his face unreadable. I don't know, he said, his voice unusually quiet. I guess we'll figure that out when we get there. I wanted to say something smart, something that would make this all feel less weird. Instead, I just let out a long sigh and leaned back against the building, trying to ignore how suddenly all the air seemed too heavy. I thought you were the no attachment, no feelings guy, I muttered, trying to distract myself from the storm cloud gathering in my chest. I am, he replied without missing a beat, but I'm also the guy who spent the last few weeks saving your life, and occasionally making it worse. So yeah, maybe I'm attached. Don't get all soft on me. I laughed, despite myself. What? You're worried about me getting soft? Lance, you're practically made of gruff. You could sleep on a cactus, and it would soften you. He actually cracked a smile at that, though it looked like it was a foreign expression he wasn't quite used to. But I took it as progress. You know, he said, eyes still scanning the streets below. If you weren't so obsessed with painting this city to expose a corrupt billionaire, this would actually be a nice evening. Well, you can't expose a corrupt billionaire with a candlelit dinner, I said, holding up the bottle like it was a trophy. Trust me, I've tried. Then I'll settle for this, he said, raising his own bottle. Here's to whatever happens next. Yeah, I said, clinking my bottle against his. Here's to whatever happens next. The thing is, as I sat there with him, the fire escape swaying under the weight of a situation I didn't fully understand, I realized something. I didn't know what was going to happen after the year was up. I didn't know if I was going to finish my mural, or if my stepfather would send another mercenary after me, or if Lance would disappear into the night like some kind of untrustworthy superhero. But for now, for that moment, with Lance and the city stretching out before us like some unfinished masterpiece, I was okay. Maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so bad if this arrangement lasted longer than either of us expected. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start believing that Lance wasn't the only one who could get attached. 2 weeks later, I found myself staring at the sleek glass doors of Thorn Enterprises, preparing for the most absurd night of my life. It was the kind of night where I could feel the wheels of fate grinding against my ribs, and I wasn't sure whether it was going to end with me laughing or calling my lawyer. Why are we even doing this? Lance muttered as he fiddled with his tie in front of the mirror, trying to make it look like he wasn't about to choke on it. Because if we don't, Marcus will know something's up, I said, sliding into my evening gown. It felt more like body armor than anything designed for a fancy gala. But whatever worked, right? Lance shot me a look from the mirror-raised eyebrow, lips twisted in skepticism. So, you're telling me we're going because your stepdad wants us there. And if we don't show up, he'll figure out we've been plotting behind his back. Exactly. He snorted, throwing on his jacket with the kind of disgust one might reserve for a root canal. Pretty sure he already knows something's up. He's not exactly subtle. Of course, he was right. Marcus Thorne had the subtlety of a freight train. His every move screamed power player. And I was trapped in this corporate circus of glittering chandeliers, ridiculous opulence, and people who wore their wealth like an extra layer skin. If there was an Olympic event for flaunting money, these people would have gold medals. I scanned the crowd. There he was, Marcus Thorne, slicing through the crowd with the precision of a shark in a pool full of overpriced orders. His every step screamed, I own this. And in that moment, I hated him more than usual. Well, Lara, he said, approaching with that slimy charm of his that could have made an eel feel inferior. Enjoying the evening. I replied coldly, looking past him, at the ice sculpture behind him. Why it had to be a replica of Marcus' face, I'll never understand, until you decided to make it awkward. He leaned in, clearly loving every second of my discomfort. Your little escapades have caused quite the stir, I must say. But you've underestimated me, my dear. I know everything. Every single thing. My stomach did an unpleasant flip. He had all the evidence, the leverage, my murals, my connections, everything that could destroy me with one phone call. Funny, I said, forcing a smile that felt like it had been grafted onto my face. I thought tonight was supposed to be about charity, not petty threats. His grin widened like a Cheshire cat that had just stumbled upon a rat's nest. Charity starts at home, doesn't it? I'm just trying to clean house, Lara. I glanced around, desperate for a sign of life, a backup. But no, Lance was still off somewhere, being the +1, which meant he was likely stuck in some awkward conversation about finger foods and ridiculously expensive wine glasses. That's when I saw him. Lance, in a tuxedo, striding across the ballroom like a man who had just walked away from an explosion, and looked good doing it. His expression said it all. I will ruin everything for you, and it will be fantastic. Lance, I said, almost sighing in relief. What are you doing? Saving your ass, he replied, loudly enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus blinked, his eyebrow twitching. And you are her husband, Lance said, extending his hand with enough force to make Marcus wince. And I'd advise you to back off. For a second, Marcus just stared at Lance. But the nerve-wracking silence didn't last long. Or what? Lance leaned in, voice dropping to a menacing growl that could have frozen hell over. Or you'll deal with me, and my llama. I turned to Lance, brows furrowed. What did you? The crowd gasped. It was too late to question anything. From the corner of the room, Diego, my llama, trotted over at the most impeccable timing. Don't ask how he got in. We still hadn't figured that out. Diego walked right up to Marcus and spat directly onto Marcus' pristine Italian leather shoes. Marcus froze, his face turning a shade of red that only comes from genuine outrage. He opened his mouth, but the words just sputtered out, failing miserably to regain any semblance of control. You, what? Marcus stammered, looking as if he was considering whether or not this was some kind of hallucination. Lance grinned, patting Diego on the head like a proud father. Good boy. He turned to Marcus, who was now about a second away from spontaneously combusting. Now, unless you want round two, I suggest you leave my wife alone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The crowd stared, trying to process what had just happened. No one dared to breathe. Finally, Marcus regained his bearings, though his face was still the color of a tomato. This isn't over, he hissed, his voice cold. Oh, it is, Lance replied with a wink. Now get out. Thorne, humiliated and furious, tried to recover his composure. But Lance wasn't done. Oh no, Lance had a flair for the dramatic. And this was far from over. Oh, and by the way, Lance added casually, as if they were just having a pleasant chat over coffee, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket and twirling it between his fingers like it was the most innocuous thing in the world. Might want to check your server security. Your little skeleton closet isn't as secure as you think. Thorne's face drained of color. His smug demeanor cracked like a fragile egg, and I could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. He began, but the words seemed to fail him. Oops, Lance said, the smirk on his face widening like a Cheshire cat. Guess you underestimated me. And with that, Lance casually slipped the flash drive back into his jacket pocket, making the entire situation seem almost lighthearted. I couldn't help but wonder if Lance had been waiting for this moment since he'd first met Thorne. This was the kind of thing that would have been on his bucket list if he actually made those kinds of lists. Thorne's face twisted in disbelief. You think this is funny? His voice was like gravel being ground underfoot. I think it's hilarious, Lance replied, unfazed, his eyes glinting with mischief. Do you? Without another word, Thorne stormed out, his entourage scrambling to keep up like a pack of nervous puppies. The crowd of gala-goers stared after him, murmuring in shock. But I didn't care. I was still processing what had just happened. Lance, I hissed, grabbing his arm, pulling him into the corner of the ballroom. What did you just do? He looked down at me with a grin that was far too pleased for my comfort. Saved your ass. Again, I stared at him blinking. And the flash drive. Lance shrugged nonchalantly, as if he hadn't just set off an atomic bomb of chaos. Empty. I stared at him, incredulous. Empty. Are you insane? You could have. He cut me off, winking as if we were in on some inside joke that I clearly wasn't. But he doesn't know that. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. You pulled off a bluff. You used a flash drive to bluff him. Hey, if it works, it works, Lance said with a dismissive weight. And let's be honest, he's a paranoid mess. Now he's going to spend the next few days checking every single server he owns, which means he'll be too distracted to notice anything else. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. And while he's running around like a headless chicken, we get time to work on our next move. I was speechless. Not because I didn't understand what he was doing, he had a point, and honestly, I wasn't sure how he pulled it off so seamlessly. But the fact that he'd done it without breaking a sweat, without even looking like he was trying, made my head spin. Unbelievable, I muttered, finally finding my voice. You really are insane. I prefer effective, Lance said with a wink. But yeah, that works too. I didn't even have time to process what had just happened before the sounds of the gala crept back in light chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft hum of the orchestra playing in the background. It felt as though nothing had changed, but in that brief exchange, everything had. You're a piece of work, you know that, I said, shaking my head. I try, Lance replied, holding up his glass of champagne like it was an award. And you're welcome. Again, I couldn't help but laugh despite myself. What are we doing, Lance? Seriously? He looked at me with that infuriatingly charming smile. I don't know. Making things interesting. I rolled my eyes, but there was something in the way he looked at me, a mix of admiration and something else that made my heart skip a beat. He was a disaster of a human being. But damn it, he was my disaster. Well, I said, taking a deep breath. Thanks for the save. No problem, he said, popping another shrimp from the appetizer table into his mouth with a wink. I've got your back, sweetheart, always. And despite everything, despite the chaos we caused, I found myself believing him. A week later, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the divorce papers lying between us. The weight of them was suffocating, but neither of us made a move to touch them. Well, Lance said, leaning back in his chair, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at his lips. This has been fun. I snorted. Fun? You nearly blew up my kitchen. Twice, he grinned, admitted you'd miss me. I wanted to punch him for his cocky attitude. But the truth was, he was right. My heart twisted at the thought of not having him around. The apartment would feel a lot emptier without his unpredictable energy and the endless chaos he brought into my life. I swallowed hard. You know, you're a nightmare. He smirked. And you're a pain in my ass. But you'd miss me anyway. I felt a soft laugh bubble up. But my chest ached, because, damn it, I would miss him. Every part of him, the sarcastic quips, the way he always seemed to be a step ahead, his ridiculous confidence, and the way his eyes lit up when he was doing something he actually cared about, even if it was just saving my ass. Stay, I said, the word slipping out before I could stop it. The second it left my lips, I froze, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. This wasn't part of the plan. This was dangerous territory. Lance's grin faltered for a split second as he blinked, surprised. What about the contract? Screw the contract, I said, my voice shaking more than I cared to admit. I wasn't even sure what I meant anymore. My heart was racing, my thoughts scattered. It's not just about the damn papers. I don't know. I'm not ready to let you go. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. And for once, Lance didn't have a sarcastic comeback. He didn't mock me or make some joke about my emotional state. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing mine as he took it in his touch warm and steady. I was hoping you'd say that, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. His usual smirk softened into something that felt real, like he wasn't just the mercenary with a dark past, but maybe someone who was starting to care. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension. But for once, I didn't need words. He didn't need me to explain myself, and I didn't need to explain him. Then, from across the room, Diego gave a triumphant bleat, as if he had just scored the winning goal at a World Cup final. He was standing in the corner, watching us intently, tail swishing like a cat who knew exactly what was going on. Lance and I both turned to look at the llama, who stared back at us with an almost knowing expression. Are we? I started, pointing at Diego. Lance snorted. Don't ask me. I think Diego's more in the know than either of us. I shook my head, but I couldn't suppress a laugh. He really is, isn't he? Lance squeezed my hand, a rare softness in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. Yeah, he is. And if he thinks we're making the right choice, then who am I to argue? I looked down at the divorce papers again, still untouched, still lying there like some forgotten relic of the past. But now, with Lance's hand in mine, the future didn't feel as heavy. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I guess we'll figure this out, I said quietly, my heart thudding with the weight of that promise. Lance grinned, leaning back in his chair, his usual swagger back in place. Figuring it out? That's my specialty, sweetheart. And with that, I realized that despite everything, despite all the chaos, and the mess we'd made of our lives, maybe, just maybe, this was the best decision I'd ever made. Diego bleated again, louder this time, as if to say, finally. And I couldn't help but laugh. The sound light and free. Maybe things weren't as screwed up as they seemed. Maybe just maybe we were actually going to be okay. The mural stood tall on the side of a city high-rise, a breathtaking masterpiece of vibrant colors and sharp truths. It was a kaleidoscope of rebellion and resilience, weaving Lara's story and the city's corruption into an undeniable tapestry. Her signature, a discreet LK, was tucked into a corner, but everyone knew who was behind it. The media erupted like a fireworks display, and within hours, the mural was the city's hottest headline. Whistleblower art exposes corruption. Read one paper. Another declared, Kane heiress takes on foreign enterprises in stunning street art revelation. Marcus Thorne's empire began to crumble at the speed of breaking news. Whistleblowers from within Thorne Enterprises, emboldened by the mural's message, came forward. Combined with the investigation Lara's mural had sparked, Marcus's financial dealings were laid bare. Bribes, shell companies, backdoor deals, it was all there. The authorities wasted no time. Thorne was arrested amid a media frenzy, his smirk gone, replaced with the sour realization that his schemes had finally caught up with him. Lara watched the news unfold with a sense of vindication and relief. The court wasted no time, declaring him unfit to serve as the guardian of Lara's inheritance. Her mother's legacy was finally untangled from Marcus's web of lies, and with that freedom came clarity. Lance and I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipping champagne as the city skyline twinkled like it was celebrating with us. Diego was lounging nearby, his latest chew toy, a discarded bow tie, from the gala dangling from his mouth. Well, Lance said, leaning back and propping his feet up on the railing. You did it. The mural, the headlines, the whole justice thing. Feels good, doesn't it? I smiled, swirling the champagne in my glass. Yeah, it does, but I couldn't have done it without you. He waved a hand dismissively. But there was a hint of pride in his eyes. I just played the charming husband. The rest was all you. I snorted. Charming, huh? That's what we're calling your llama chaos and questionable tuxedo choices. Admit it, he said, smirking. You'd miss the chaos. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a warmth I hadn't realized had been missing. He wasn't wrong. Life with Lance and Diego had been anything but boring. Maybe, I said, setting my glass down and leaning closer. But chaos has its perks. He raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. Oh, so now you're a fan of my methods. Let's just say I've learned to appreciate them, I replied, my voice teasing. Diego bleated, interrupting the moment, like the drama queen he was. Lance groaned and tossed him a carrot. He's really the boss, isn't he? I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. Absolutely. As the city buzzed beneath us and the stars blinked overhead, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running, hiding, or fighting for survival. I was just happy. And maybe, just maybe, chaos wasn't such a bad thing after all. Story ends. See you again for another silly story.